All right, so let's dive into these California wildfires everyone's been talking about. We've got a ton of articles here, eyewitness accounts, expert analyses, the whole works, and we need to cut through all the noise and try to figure out exactly what's going on, why it matters so much, and what kind of bigger picture questions all these fires raise.
It is amazing how fast these fires just exploded early this January. Southern California went from, relatively normal to like an inferno in just days.
Yeah, it's like tens of thousands of acres just scorched, over 20 lives lost, tragically, and just this mass exodus of people forced to flee their homes. This is crazy. Like, imagine a wildfire just ripping through like over half of Taipei City. It's just mind-blowing, the scale of the destruction.
Yeah, and what makes these fires like particularly ferocious is that there's just this like unique set of conditions it's primed the whole landscape for disaster. So last year was actually pretty wet, and that led to a ton of vegetation growth, but then it all dried out completely, creating all this fuel, and then, you add in the notorious Santa Ana winds to the mix.
Okay, wait, hold on. Back up a second. So those of us not up on all the, like, California weather lingo, what exactly are Santa Ana winds?
Okay, so picture this. These, like, hot, dry gusts that originate in the Great Basin, and then they, like, pick up speed as they come down towards the coast, and they basically become, like, giant bellows, blowing across the landscape. So any spark, no matter how tiny, can turn into a raging inferno.
Oh, wow. So nature essentially set the stage with, like, what actually lit the match? Any clues on what sparked these fires?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. Lightning has been ruled out for at least 2 of the biggest fires, which leaves investigators looking into other possibilities.
Arson. I mean, that has to be on the table, right? From what I read.
Oh, absolutely. There's been 1 arrest already in Azusa, and honestly, with how dry everything is, I feel like it wouldn't have taken much at all to set off this whole disaster.
Yeah. I mean, it's just heartbreaking seeing just the scale of destruction. Homes just reduced to ash, these iconic landmarks just shrouded in smoke. One official even described some areas as looking like an atomic bomb went off.
Yeah, that visual, it really captures how intense this whole situation is. And it's important to remember, too, this isn't just property damage. The human cost is just immense.
Yeah.
Beyond the tragic loss of life, you've got the trauma of people being displaced, the uncertainty about the future, and this long, arduous journey that they have to rebuild.
And rebuilding the economic toll of this disaster is just almost unimaginable, isn't it?
The numbers are just staggering. Early estimates are saying insurance losses could go above $20 billion. $20 billion. With the total economic impact potentially like reaching $50 billion. But even those figures, they can't really capture the human suffering and the emotional toll that this event has taken.
No, amidst all this devastation, I was just so struck by the stories of like resilience and community, spirit. You've got firefighters just working tirelessly, risking their lives to contain these blazes, and just everyday people stepping up to help their neighbors. It's really incredible.
It really is remarkable how people just come together in these times of crisis. Like, there's a story about this family who they lost their entire home, but in the middle of all the ruins, their statues of the Virgin Mary and St. Joseph, they were completely unscathed.
Oh, yeah. I read that. It's like such a powerful symbol of hope in the middle of all this destruction. And it really resonated with people, too, from what I saw online.
Yeah, it really does show how even facing just immense loss, people find ways to hold on to their faith and find meaning, and just that shared experience, that collective search for hope. It can be really unifying for a whole community.
For sure. So speaking of finding hope, there's been like a ton of buzz about Elon Musk and his involvement in the relief effort. What do you make of all that?
His actions have definitely caught everyone's attention. He's deployed a whole fleet of those Cybertrucks, those futuristic ones, and they're equipped with Starlink satellite internet, so they're acting as these like mobile Wi-Fi hotspots.
Well, wait, so for those of us who aren't like, tech wizards, break that down for me. What's so special about Starlink in this situation?
So basically, Starlink, it uses this network of like low orbit satellites, and this lets it provide internet access. What's cool about that is it can bypass any damaged ground infrastructure, which is a huge plus in disaster zones because, communication networks are often down.
So people in areas where the power and communication are down can still connect with, like loved ones, family, access, like vital information. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's a great example of how we can use technology, for good in disaster response. Now, there has been some debate, though, about whether this is really the most effective way to use resources, Some argue that just donating money to, like, established relief organizations might have a bigger impact.
That's a good point. It makes you think about how we even measure impact in these situations.
Oh, for sure. And it also kind of speaks to Musk's larger point about the balance between environmental protection and wildfire prevention. He's been pretty vocal about his concerns that, California's environmental regulations are actually kind of hindering efforts to create fire breaks and clear brush around homes.
There's definitely been a lot of chatter online about that. What are the specific regulations he's talking about?
One example that keeps coming up is the California red-legged frog. It's an endangered species, and the regulations to protect its habitat have, according to some sources, made it more difficult to implement certain fire prevention measures.
So it's like this constant tension between protecting the environment and protecting human lives and property.
Exactly. It's complex, no easy answers,
Yeah.
and these fires have definitely brought that whole debate back to the forefront.
Yeah. This reminds me of something that came up in one of the articles about the psychological impact of these fires. It's not just the physical loss, right?
Absolutely not. Just imagine, the stress and anxiety of having to evacuate your home in the middle of the night, not knowing if you can ever even go back or what you're going to find when you do.
It's a level of uncertainty and fear that most of us just can't even imagine.
The emotional scars from this kind of disaster, they're going to last long after the fires themselves are put out. It's really important that we provide adequate mental health support to those affected, both in the immediate aftermath and, long term.
Yeah, and that's where those stories of community support become even more vital, right? It's not just about rebuilding homes, it's rebuilding lives, a sense of community.
Exactly. And that's where those long-term recovery efforts come in.
And those efforts face some pretty massive challenges, I would imagine.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, beyond just the logistics of rebuilding homes and infrastructure, there's the whole question of how to even begin to address the underlying causes of these increasingly frequent and intense wildfires.
Right. And speaking of those underlying causes, climate change has been a big part of the discussion around these fires.
It is hard to ignore the role that climate change is playing. We know that higher temperatures and these extended droughts, they create those drier conditions that just make vegetation more likely to burn. And as those trends keep going, the risk of these catastrophic wildfires, it just gets bigger.
So it's almost like, we've got this perfect storm brewing, where dry vegetation, you've got strong winds, and then a warming climate all coming together to create this disastrous situation. It's a pretty bleak picture.
It really is. And it really underscores the need for a multifaceted approach to addressing this crisis. We need to be thinking about prevention, mitigation, and long-term solutions.
Okay, let's unpack those a bit. What are some key strategies for wildfire prevention and mitigation?
One important one is forest management. This can include things like thinning out those dense forests, getting rid of dead trees and brush, and doing controlled burns to reduce the amount of flammable material.
Those controlled burns, they could be pretty controversial though, right?
Yeah, they can be. But when they're done right, they actually mimic the natural role of fire in the forest ecosystems. And that helps prevent those, catastrophic megafires.
So it's about finding that balance between protecting the environment and, managing those risks.
Exactly. And that balance is becoming even harder to find as climate change just, intensifies all these challenges.
What about on an individual level? In terms of preparedness, what can people do to protect themselves and their homes?
One of the best things individuals can do is create what's called the defensible space around their home. That basically means clearing out vegetation and using fire-resistant materials so you can reduce that risk of fire spreading to structures.
And what about those of us who aren't, right in those fire-prone areas? Is there anything we can do to help out?
Oh, absolutely. We can support organizations that are doing the relief work and, working on those long-term solutions. We can also stay informed about all these issues and advocate for policies that address climate change and support, sustainable practices.
That makes sense. We've talked a lot about the impact on people, but what about the environmental consequences?
Oh, the ecological impact of these fires is huge. We're talking about loss of habitat, air and water pollution, and even the release of greenhouse gases up into the atmosphere.
So it's almost like a vicious cycle, right? You've got climate change contributing to more intense wildfires, and then those fires make the climate crisis even worse.
It's a complicated, interconnected problem, and it highlights just how urgent it is to find those sustainable solutions.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here, but it feels like we're just scratching the surface. Where do we go from here? What are some of the biggest questions these fires raise about the future?
That is the question, isn't it? I mean, these fires, they force us to look at some really uncomfortable truths about our relationship with nature and the choices that we're making as a society.
And we'll dig into that more in the next parts of our deep dive. We'll explore what the long-term implications of these wildfires are and talk about what lessons we can learn for the future.
It's kind of wild how these fires really show just how interconnected everything is. Like, decisions made so far away from the flames can have a huge impact on those right on the front lines.
Yeah, it's a real chain reaction, huh? From like global weather patterns down to like local land management practices. Everything's linked.
And that's exactly why it's so hard to find solutions. It's not just about putting out the fires, it's about figuring out like those underlying vulnerabilities and tackling those.
So we've talked about forest management, defensible spaces, but like, is there more that we could be doing, like in terms of early warning systems?
Oh, there's definitely room for improvement there. I mean, some experts are pushing for us to invest in like more high-tech stuff, AI-powered systems, things that can analyze all those weather patterns and predict the fire risk, but with way more accuracy.
So being able to like predict where fires are most likely to happen, that could give those firefighters a head start and maybe like save lives, save property.
Exactly. And it could even help with like allocating resources. Imagine being able to pre-position firefighters and equipment in those high-risk areas beforehand. That'd make a huge difference.
Yeah, absolutely. But even with the like best technology, it seems like these fires are getting tougher and tougher to contain. Is that because they're just burning hotter, spreading faster? What's going on?
Well, that's definitely part of it. Climate change is a big factor. It's making these fires more intense and unpredictable. But there's also just the simple problem of limited resources. Those firefighting crews they're stretched so thin and they're dealing with, fatigue, burnout. It's a huge problem.
It's just heroic work. But yeah, it just doesn't seem sustainable in the long run. What are some solutions people are suggesting to address that resource shortage?
Well, there's been a lot of calls for more funding for firefighting agencies, both at the state and the federal levels, which makes sense. That would let them hire more firefighters, get better equipment, and just provide more training and support for those folks who are, risking their lives out there.
Makes sense. But it also seems like we got to be thinking beyond just the traditional methods of firefighting, right? Like, what are some of the more outside-the-box approaches that are being considered for fire suppression?
Well, there's a lot of buzz about using drones more extensively, and not just for like surveillance and mapping, but like actually fighting fires.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I've heard about that, like drones equipped with fire retardant or water so they can get into those areas that are just way too dangerous for ground crews.
Right. And they could even start backfires, those controlled burns that help create fire breaks.
Very cool. Speaking of innovation, there's been all this talk about the role of artificial intelligence in wildfire management, too.
Yeah, AI has huge potential. I mean, we've already touched on using it for early warning systems, but it can even analyze fire behavior in real time. That can give firefighters so much more information to make smarter decisions.
It's like having this, like, virtual fire strategist right there with them.
Kind of, yeah. AI can look at all this data, weather, the terrain, vegetation, how the fire's behaving. And it can give them insights that humans just wouldn't be able to see in the heat of the moment.
That's amazing. It sounds like AI could totally change the game when it comes to managing wildfires.
Yeah.
But there's got to be some ethical concerns too, right?
Oh, of course. Anytime you're talking about using AI in these high-stakes situations, you got to think about potential bias, and the need for transparency and accountability.
Yeah, we don't want to just blindly trust algorithms without understanding how they're making these decisions and what the consequences could be.
Right. And we need to make sure there's still human oversight. That's crucial.
For sure. This whole conversation about technology and innovation, it really highlights the fact that we're at this turning point, like a crossroads when it comes to managing wildfires.
Yeah.
We can't just keep doing the same old thing.
Nope. We've got to be bold, think creatively, embrace those new technologies, come up with new strategies, and really, truly rethink how we interact with nature.
And we got to do it fast because the stakes are just getting higher and higher. These fires are a real wake-up call. They're telling us loud and clear that we can't ignore climate change anymore.
It's a challenge, that's for sure. It demands our attention, our ingenuity, and, just our collective will to do something about it.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the big picture, but I want to focus on one specific thing about these fires that I found really interesting. The air quality.
Oh, yeah, that's a crucial aspect, and one that often gets overlooked. Those images we talked about earlier of Los Angeles just covered in smoke, those are a stark reminder of the health risks that come with all that wildfire smoke.
And it's not just about the way it looks either. This is serious stuff with serious health consequences.
Wildfire smoke, it's like this toxic cocktail of pollutants, It can irritate your lungs, trigger asthma attacks, and even up the risk of heart attacks and strokes.
And it's not just people right near the fires who are at risk either.
No, not at all. These pollutants can travel for hundreds, even thousands of miles, so you could be far away from a wildfire and still be affected by the smoke.
Wow. So what can people do to protect themselves from wildfire smoke?
Well, one of the most effective things is just to stay indoors as much as possible. Keep your windows and doors shut. If you have to go outside, an N95 mask can help filter out some of those harmful particles.
And it's important to stay updated on air quality conditions in your area too, right?
Absolutely. There are websites, apps that'll give you real-time air quality data, and there are usually public health advisories put out during those wildfire events, so pay attention to those.
It all goes back to being prepared, right? Knowing the risks and taking steps to protect yourself and your family.
Exactly. And it's not just physical health either. These fires can really take a toll on mental health too.
Yeah, we talked about the trauma of evacuating, but then there's just this constant anxiety of living under the threat of fire,
Yeah.
the uncertainty of what the future holds, and of course, the grief of losing so much.
It's a lot to deal with, and it shows how much we need mental health support services for those who are impacted by these disasters.
It's not just about rebuilding homes, it's about rebuilding lives, whole communities.
And that's a process that can take years, even decades.
Which is why it's so crucial to think about the long-term impacts of these fires.
Yeah.
They're not just a one-time thing. They're part of this bigger trend that's changing the landscape and the lives of everyone who calls California home.
And unfortunately, it's a trend that's likely to continue as climate change keeps intensifying.
So as we kind of wrap up this part of our deep dive, I think it's important to think about this. If we could go back in time, knowing everything we know now about climate change and these, more frequent, more intense fires, what would we have done differently?
That is a big question. It makes you really face those past choices, and think about what other paths we could have taken.
Would we have invested more in, preventing fires, mitigating the damage? Would we have done more to tackle climate change?
Those are the questions we're going to keep wrestling with as we figure out how to navigate this new reality.
And as we go into the last part of our deep dive, we're going to explore those questions even more and talk about what lessons we can take away from these fires, to create a future that's more sustainable, more resilient. We've talked a lot about the immediate impacts, like all the destruction, people being displaced, the incredible work those firefighters are doing. But I keep thinking about, what happens next? What does recovery even look like on this massive of a scale?
Yeah, it's a long road, a complicated process, and it's so much more than just rebuilding the physical stuff. You got to think about restoring the whole ecosystem, bringing the economy back to life, and dealing with, those really deep psychological scars that are left behind.
So let's start with the environmental side of things. What are some of the biggest hurdles in getting these scorched landscapes back on their feet?
Well, one of the toughest ones is erosion. I mean, when a fire rips through like that, it just wipes out all the vegetation that holds the soil together, and that makes the whole area vulnerable to landslides, mud flows, especially when you think about how much rain could come in the next few months.
So it's not even just the initial damage. It's this domino effect of potential environmental problems down the road.
Exactly. And then you've got, all the habitat loss. I mean, these fires have displaced tons of animals, and it's going to take a long time for those ecosystems to bounce back. Some species might never fully recover.
It's tough to think about those long-term consequences for the environment. So what are people doing? What strategies are they using to help these areas recover?
Well, there are a few different approaches. One big one is reseeding the burned areas with native plants. That helps to stabilize the soil, prevent erosion, and create a habitat for wildlife to come back to.
I can only imagine that's a huge task, given how widespread these fires were.
Oh, it is. It is. And it takes a lot of planning, a lot of coordination. You have to make sure you're picking the right plants for that specific ecosystem, and that the seeds actually have a fighting chance to survive.
It's like this delicate dance between, stepping in and helping and letting nature do its thing.
That's it. Exactly. And then there's the whole issue of how to manage the risks of future fires. We've talked about those forest management techniques, but then you have to think about broader policy changes too.
Like what? What kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about building codes and zoning regulations. Some experts are saying we need to rethink where and how we build in these fire-prone areas, period.
So like maybe stricter building codes, making sure people are using fire-resistant materials, or even like limiting development in those high-risk zones altogether.
Right, those are some of the ideas being tossed around. It's about acknowledging that the risk is real and taking steps to actually, do something about it.
Which brings us back to that personal responsibility piece, right?
For sure. It's about recognizing that everyone has a part to play in building a future that's more resilient. Whether it's choosing fire-resistant landscaping for your own home
Right.
or supporting those policies that are trying to tackle climate change, it all adds up.
Right. And this brings me to another part of recovery that I think is super important, the economic side of things.
Yeah.
These fires have been devastating for businesses, for tourism, for the whole region's economy.
Oh, yeah, the ripple effects are huge. You've got businesses that had to shut down and lost all that revenue, tourism taking a hit, the costs of rebuilding all that infrastructure. It's a massive blow on multiple levels.
And it's not even just about what's lost right now, right?
Yeah.
There's also the challenge of rebuilding those industries in the long term and getting people to invest in these areas again.
Exactly. And that's where the government can really step in and make a difference. Things like financial assistance for businesses, investing in infrastructure, creating those incentives to encourage new businesses to set up shop in these areas, that can all help jumpstart the recovery.
But it's not just about recreating what was there before, is it? It's about building an economy that's stronger, more resilient, one that can weather those future storms.
That's a key point. These fires have really exposed the weak spots in our current systems. They've shown us that we need to diversify our economies, put our money into renewable energy, and just create more sustainable practices across the board.
It's like that saying, build back better, not just back to how it was.
Absolutely. And to do that, you need that long-term vision, and you need everyone working together. The government, businesses, the community, all on the same page.
Speaking of community, let's talk about that social and emotional recovery. These fires have been incredibly traumatic, caused so much upheaval. How do communities even begin to stitch their social fabric back together and heal after something this devastating?
It's a long road, a difficult one, and there's no one right answer. But one thing that's really important is creating those spaces where people can come together, share their experiences, support each other.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of community gatherings, support groups, even art therapy programs popping up.
Those are all really valuable ways to help people process what they've been through and start to heal. And it's crucial to remember that, that emotional recovery can take a lot longer than rebuilding the physical stuff.
Absolutely. It's about tending to those invisible wounds as much as the ones we can see.
And it's about building that resilience, learning from what we've been through, adapting to these changing conditions, and finding those ways to support each other through the tough times ahead.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive into the California wildfires, I think it's clear that we're really just starting to grasp the full impact of this disaster and what it means for the future.
These fires have been a real wake-up call. It's like this stark reminder that everything's connected and we need to take action on climate change, like now.
They've forced us to really look at how we interact with the natural world, to invest in resilience and build a future that's sustainable and fair for everyone.
And they've shown us just how powerful the human spirit can be. The courage, the compassion, the resilience that people have shown in the face of all this. It's amazing.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and got you thinking. We'll be back soon to explore another complex and fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged.